Police Minister Senzo Mchunu has described aspects of the SAPS Act as outdated, revealing plans to amend them. He outlined safety and security priorities for the new administration this morning, affirming a renewed commitment, he says, to fighting crime. Mchunu says this will require an improved approach.
We will prioritize the amendments of the South African Police Services Act as it is outdated in relation to some aspects thereof that we have looked at. For instance, it still makes incorrect references to the 1993 interim constitution. We believe this is outdated and it needs to be brought to date. It needs to be in line with the modern day crime fighting and prevention demands. We will also finalize the national policy on policing so that we have a functional policy on policing. It must take into account provincial needs and dynamics and also provincial priorities.
Mchunu says he's hoping for intelligence-driven policing, but he is concerned about budget and resources.
Crime intelligence is the backbone of policing and will be an apex priority on our side. Robust crime intelligence capabilities are essential for maintaining public safety, reducing crime rates, and fostering a secure environment for communities. Certainly, our budget as it stands at the moment, just for this financial year, will need to be reviewed at some point when the first opportunity arises, so that we cater for increased capacity as far as crime intelligence is concerned.
All right, let's get you some analysis on the Police Minister's maiden address. We're joined this afternoon by the Head of Justice and Violence Prevention at the Institute of Security Studies, Gareth Newham. It's great to talk to you. Thanks very much for coming on. And certainly, Gareth, on the face of it, some important points being made by the Minister. I'm thinking specifically about his hope for the return to intelligence-driven policing. What else stands out for you?
Yes, it was a very welcome statement. It's clear that in the short time that he's been the minister, he's been briefed a lot. He spent a lot of time speaking to top leadership of the South African Police Service and the various agencies that will report to him, such as the Independent Police Investigative Directorate and Civilian Secretariat for Police. So he's got a good idea of some of the issues that are currently in the forefront of their minds. I think for us, we really welcome the fact that he's understanding that there's a range of different issues that need to be addressed. That there's not one simple solution to tackling crime in South Africa. He's also really looked quite closely at the South African Police Service's capabilities. So issues that really stood out for us is the need to improve the professionalism of the South African Police Service, so that when you go to a police station, you know exactly the kind of standard of service you should be getting. When you see police officers on the street, you don't have any concerns about whether they're going to try and take a bribe from you or whether they'll help you. So he's very clear about, at that level, you need to have very clear standards, and he wants to develop those and make sure that they stand out and are available to community so people know what they can expect when they see police officers and when they go to police stations. For us as well, the issue of technology and crime intelligence, because there's no way that the South African Police Service, even though it's got very large numbers of people working for it, can police everybody in the country, all over 62 million people. So crime intelligence is that function that helps the police target their resources effectively. There's a relatively few number of people who commit most serious violent crime in South Africa and most organized crime. And intelligence is a function that identifies those people, the networks, where they operate and how they operate, and then can really help the police focus its resources more effectively and in that way reduce crime. So that was very important. And then, of course, linked to that is removing firearms off the streets. He mentioned this is a particular issue, and we also really agree. We've seen murder going up quite dramatically in the last decade or so, and it's really been driven by gunshot wounds. So we really want to see the police getting on top of those who possess illegal firearms, trade in firearms illegally, and try and commit crimes with firearms. And then very close linkly to that was corruption, dealing with police corruption particularly. We know that a lot of firearms, over 700 firearms from the police get lost every year. And some of that has to do with police corruption. And of course, police corruption only acts in the favor of criminals. when police officers use their powers to take bribes and support criminals, then all of us suffer, and it's very difficult to get on top of the crime rate. So he mentioned a number of very important interventions that he'll be looking closely at, and we think they're the right ones.
Yeah. I've got the statement here in front of me, the minister's address that he gave this morning, the new minister. And, you know, the professionalization of the SAPS stood out for me as well as I was going through the various points, Gareth. But he also mentioned some other issues that have been on police's agenda for some time, right, for some administrations. And one of them is gang violence in the Western Cape in particular. He particularly points out the Western Cape. He talks about the Cape Flats, Khayelitsha Site C, parts of Nelson Mandela Bay and Gauteng as well. And this is an important one, is it? Because we haven't seen the needle move on the issue of gang violence, I would argue, at all over decades.
Exactly, and I think that's where the other priority you mentioned was very important to this. It's partnerships. The result, the gangsterism occurs not only because of weaknesses in policing. It's about underdevelopment, generally high levels of unemployment or poverty, lack of opportunities for young people to be able to improve their lives, and underservices or low, very weak service delivery from government. So that creates an environment in which groups of people then step into that environment, and they form gangs or various kinds of groups, and largely then get involved in the illicit economy because it's the easiest and quickest way to make money. So dealing in drugs, firearms, and a range of other illicit activity is how they operate. So it's not just only a policing matter. Of course, the police have a critically important role to play, and it goes back to our intelligence. They need to identify who are the heads of these gangs, who are the networks, how do they operate, and so they can proactively address this. And we have seen some good successes in the Western Cape in recent months. Of course, as he mentioned, there are other areas that they need to really get on top of as well. But it's not only the police. So I think he mentioned other government departments, other sectors, the private sector and so forth, civil society, that when you go into a place where there's a high level of gang activity, you've got to also bring in other departments to make sure that you address some of those other issues, because they're the push factors that push people or young people into gangs. And so that was also an important acknowledgement that he recognized that they need to open up and develop much stronger partnerships with other groups and organizations.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a difficult one because I feel like we have been saying this and ministers have been saying this, and organizations like the Institute of Security Studies, it's sort of the same conversation we've been having on the issue of gang violence, isn't it?
Yes, and I think, another issue that he mentioned, which was quite important and might have not been noticed, is about management decision-making. So the ability, because of the South African Police Service being so large and complex, your top management structures are sitting in Pretoria, for example, but stations, all across the country, that's where a lot of policing is taking place. And he mentioned the 30th high murder or contact crime stations, and that big distance, you've got to look at the systems that are available to take information, turn that information into effective analysis, and then provide recommendations to those at the top of the organization so they can make good decisions that ultimately ensure that those police officers at the ground are properly resourced, trained, supported, and if they do not do their jobs, held accountable. So I think that's something you mentioned, and I think that is something that's quite new. You haven't really heard ministers before talk about the police organization, how it uses technology, how it makes decisions to that extent. So I think that's an important shift that people probably won't notice, because what we've seen in the past is police ministers saying the big bold things. We're going to have high visibility, the army's going to come in. Those things don't generally work unless there's a range of other important organizational improvements taking place. And he seems to have understood that, and he was mentioning that in his speech this morning.
All right. And then you've mentioned a number of times now, Gareth, the issue of police being properly resourced. And it's something that the minister also mentioned quite a few times in the statement that I have here in front of me. Several budget votes are taking place in Parliament this week. I think the police budget vote is, it's happening tomorrow. What are some of the key priority areas that you think that the budget needs to look at?
Well, I think one of the issues is about efficiency. The South African Police Service will be receiving a lot of money in the future. So currently the budget is 113 billion. In 2 years' time, it'll go up to about 124 billion rand. That's not a small budget. So I think it's more about making sure that you structure your organization so that you're resourcing those environments and functions. You mentioned crime intelligence, investigations. Those functions have the biggest impact on public safety. But for example, what we've seen in recent years is a ballooning of the VIP protection unit budgets, which only protect a very small handful of people. And it was news this morning that the budget for protecting the VIPs in the country, which are less than 200 people, the budget there is much bigger than the entire budget for the investigation units that deal with gender-based violence and violence against children and women. So there you can see, if they start looking at where are they putting their money in that organization to have the best impact, there's probably a range of ways in which they could yield quite good efficiencies, downgrade the functions that are not that important to public safety, and then further push resources into those areas that are going to have the biggest impact. So you'll have an opportunity, I think, in the coming months to look at the medium-term expenditure framework going forward, and working with the police management. Hopefully we'll start seeing new allocations to areas that have been relatively under-resourced by cutting costs to those areas that have very little impact on the safety of you and me and the public in general.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it's always a good measure. We usually do the 100 days in office measure of how far you have come in the past 100 days. So Gareth Newham, thanks for giving us some perspective of some of the issues that we need to focus on as we build up to Senzo Mchunu and many other ministers in their first 100 days in office. Gareth Newham is with the Institute of Security Studies.